Hello, it is Matt Weaver with Bible Truth Project, and today I have a special guest who I'm excited to interview. His name is Dr. Doug Hamp, and he wrote an interesting book that I just finished reading called Corrupting the Image 2. It's the second part in a series, and he's actually currently writing a third book. And it's a very interesting material that I think is very relevant to the day that we live in, to understand the ancient world, the connections to the ancient world that often probably affect us more than we even realize. So I'm excited to have him on the show, and I think we're going to learn some really exciting things from Dr. Hamp. Dr. Hamp is an author, and he's also a pastor of a church in Colorado. And he wrote a book that got my attention a few weeks ago. He was on a show, actually a podcast with Derek Gilbert, and I listened to the podcast, and it brought a memory up of something that happened some time ago, and we're going to get into that later. But thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Doug. I know that you're busy and you've got a lot of projects and things going on, but I appreciate you taking the time to come on here and talk about what you've written.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me just go back a little bit. 15 years ago, and this is kind of how this whole thing kicked off, and this is why I felt it would be interesting to have a conversation. 15 years ago, my dad, who is a pastor of the church that I go to, had a vision, and it was on his 50th, close to his first 50th birthday. He had gone through a period of tremendous travail. It seems like in his life, about every 10 years, he has a period of travail as God is taking him into the next season of his ministry. But in this season of travail, one night he had a vision, and this vision was extremely dramatic. He's not had a lot of visions in his life. He's had a few, but this one was the most dramatic that he's had. And I remember him relaying it later, even years after. Literally, he would in some ways almost start shaking. But basically, the vision was that he saw the glory of God, and he saw the glory as just these rays that were so powerful. I mean, the energy was at a level that literally could pierce anything, and it's just indescribable. And basically, and there's a lot to it. I'm not going to get through the whole thing. But there was one part of this that piqued my interest in the conversation I had heard with you and Derek, is as he would walk, the glory would shine, and he saw a building that was being built, but it wasn't finished yet. There were still a section that needed to be completed. And as he walked, he saw the glory shining around him, and he saw this building. When he stopped, all of a sudden the glory disappeared, and he saw bleachers that were propped up in front of that building. And it was full of people, conservative people, from just all sorts of different, denominations, et cetera, that were on those bleachers covering up this hole in the side of this building. And as he continued to walk, the glory would shine, the bleachers would disappear, the people would disappear, and he'd see the building as it is again, unfinished. And he stopped several times, and every time he would stop, the glory would stop. Every time he'd start walking again, the glory would start again. And ultimately, he came up to the corner of the building, and there was a huge cornerstone, and he leaned against that. And as he leaned against it, the glory continuously shone. Now, there was a lot of messaging, I guess, that the Lord was showing him for the season that he was in that time. But what piqued my interest is that he describes actually seeing what we would call Satan or Lucifer, which is a bad translation, I understand. But he sees him, and this is what piqued my interest. He described him, and just for lack of, I guess, terms or vocabulary understanding, trying to describe what he saw, he described him looking like a giant ostrich. And his color, he just says, is like oozing green, like toxic, just venomous toxins coming out of him. I mean, it was just, the picture he describes is just absolutely toxic, but just oozing this toxin. But he described him looking kind of like an ostrich. But that was the closest thing. There's nothing really that he could, kind of relate it to. And the most striking thing was that under his wings, he had two huge treasure chests, which were just absolutely loaded with the like precious gems, jewels, gold, silver, all sorts of precious things. And the Lord showed him that this is what he is stealing from my people. That the enemy is absolutely stealing all sorts of treasure and gems and jewels that I have, that I want to give my people. He's taking these things. And
Wow.
But all that to say that when the conversation, you go and you talk about this Anzu bird, and it immediately was like, I wonder if that's what Dad saw. So I just Googled it really quick and looked at some different artist renderings and renditions, etc. And I found one that a modern artist had done. And I sent it to him and I said, is this similar to what you saw? And he said, yeah, absolutely. That is very close to what he saw. So from that point, now you had my curiosity. So I got your book, read the book. And it was absolutely, it's an amazing piece.
Thank you.
I've been to Israel half a dozen times. I've not spent the time as that you have, but I've been there half a dozen times. I've been to Jordan a couple times. I've been, Egypt, that stuff too. And something that has hit me is that many times in the West, we're very ignorant of the worldview of the region. So, for instance, we know Abraham came from Mesopotamia. He comes out of, the Sumerian kingdom or Sumer. And the mythologies that originated from that kingdom literally influenced almost every religion on the face of the earth. But it's pivotal because in that time frame, God calls Abraham out of that and chooses Israel for his people and his nation. The rest is history. So I'm going to kind of step back now and let you fill in. But I don't know what are your thoughts on what I told you about the Anzu? I mean,
I do not claim to be an interpreter of dreams. I find Daniel and Joseph are better at that than I am.
Oh.
I can barely understand my own dreams, but it's fascinating. That he would have such a vision. And that, this bird, just so people understand, I personally wouldn't call it a bird. It looks more like a lion to me with wings, but that's what they called it. They call it the Anzu bird. And so, we have to go with that. But, there's so much happening behind the scenes on this spiritual level that I think, it's really easy for us to kind of, go to church, we go in, we do our thing, we talk about Jesus, and we leave, right? And nothing wrong with that, but there's so much more to the story. The Bible is just replete with information about the spiritual realm. But, you have to kind of, you have to kind of thread your needle as you're going through the Bible to find these things and then to collate them so that you can really have a better picture. And I'll tell you, it blew my mind when I started going back. And I started with a question: why would the book of Revelation refer to Satan as the great dragon? Okay, he did, but why? Why is that such a term? Right. And then as I started looking into these things, and I found that the woman that rides the beast, well, she's there in color, right, in the ancient Near East. I mean, bold, brilliant colors, and you see the beast. Right. Which, so there's one, and I have it at the beginning of my book of this woman who's on the back. I don't know if people can kind of see that, but sure. It's hard to see. But so that woman that's on the back of that beast, that is Inanna. That's the queen of heaven. And the beast that she's on is the Anzu bird. And when you're talking about having venom and all this different stuff, well, that's exactly what this Anzu bird, or this winged lion, this chimeric creature has, is it's spewing out this venom, this toxic venom out of its mouth. And so that's what the ancient world was calling a dragon. We sometimes think of the Walt Disney kind of dragon, or something like that. And that's a variation on a theme for sure. But, the dragons back then were a bit less dinosaur and more chimera, right? And really, when you start looking at the description of the cherubim in the book of Ezekiel, right? Because Satan was one of the cherubs, right? He was one of the cherubim He was the anointed cherub. And so we see these 4 different faces. And in Hebrew, the word for face is panim. So the word face is actually plural. So you have faces, not a face, right? And that seems foreign to us. But when you start to think about it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have tons of faces, right? Got my happy face, got my sad face, and all these different things. And so I wear lots of faces every day. And when you start looking at the different descriptions of what Satan has looked like through the literature, you begin to see that he has the face of a lion. He's got the face of a bull, the face of an eagle, and the face of a man. And they're all more or less summed up in this Anzu bird. And then as the iconography evolved over the centuries, we find that he then goes from being this winged lion to then being a bit more of a centaur, still the same basic creature. And then he has 2 heads, one the head of a man, and then the other one the head of a lion. And it's astounding when you look at and compare Revelation chapter 9 of the creature that's going to come out of the abyss. It's exactly the same as Nergal, who is the god of the underworld, which is yet another manifestation of Enlil, who is Satan, right? So all roads lead back to him. It really is amazing.
Well, I had, this last winter, there was a group of us from church, all that have been to Israel, just wanting to study more the prophetic word and getting into it in a deeper way. And going through that material again, and then when I was reading in your book, the different things that it describes, as far as making the connections to the images, it's so, to me, it's so clear. The connections that you draw to these ancient Mesopotamian creatures, I mean, there it is. Like you talk about the Queen of Heaven, I think Inanna, and it's, she's represented in many different cultures, different ways, but it's the same spirit, I guess you would say. Or Enlil, gets translated, et cetera. It goes into a lot of different faces. And then the ultimate seed, if you will, which Genesis 3:15, which is the kind of the really original prophetic verse in Scripture where God really lays out what it's all about. That there'll be a conflict between seeds, and ultimately the ultimate seed of humanity will fight against the ultimate seed of Satan, and will be overcome that way. But you just dig into some of this material and bring so much clarity to it. I've read, Dr. Heiser's works on, a lot of his books and different things. I even gone back and 2 years ago, I had an atheist friend who wanted me to read some Sitchin just because he thought that would be helpful. And before that, I've read Flood Legend stuff, Epic Gilgamesh, that sort of stuff. So I was, semi-familiar, but nobody really had put this imagery together. And when you overlay it with what prophecy is describing, like, for instance, Daniel, the four-headed beast coming out, or Revelation, for instance, all the different images, you can actually show pictures of what these things look like. And I've never seen really anybody do that before. And I'm sure they have. I just not seen it. It was astounding to me.
Thank you. It was astounding to me as well. It's one of these things that you sort of have an idea of where you're going, but you don't really know until you start on the journey. Right. And that's, I had a basic sense that I might find something back there. But when I really started looking at Ishtar, the Queen of Heaven, and I'm like, wait, I know that there's, this iconography from back then. And then I just started uncovering all these other things. And I'm like, my mind is blown right here, and it was amazing how I discovered that Enlil. So just so people understand, Enlil is the name of Satan. Okay, where do we get this? You actually find it in the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah 14, where it says, "Oh, Lucifer, son of the morning," right? That's what we typically have in English. Yep. But the Hebrew there is Halel, and Halel goes back to the Akkadian Elil, which then goes back to the Sumerian Enlil. Now, for people that have no idea what I'm talking about, Sumerian or Sumer is the same as Shinar in your Bible. So if you go to Genesis chapter 11, where it talks about how Nimrod well, 10, how Nimrod established his kingdom. And then, of course, in chapter 11, you have the Tower of Babel, right? All of that was done in the land of Shinar. So Shinar just means the two rivers, Shnei Nerot, which then becomes Sumer in the Sumerian language. And then, of course, it becomes Sumerology and all this other stuff. So that is the cradle of civilization. That's as far back as we can go with written history. And there's a lot of it. And this, according to the Bible, is where it started out. So Satan established his kingdom there. And that is where he established the Tower of Babel, obviously, and then also the false religion that came with it, right? Babel. I mean, this is where it all goes back to. And as I taught through the book of Revelation about 1.5 years ago. And, I kept wondering, like, why are these symbols here? Why do we have these weird symbols of a woman riding a beast? I've heard that it was talking about the Roman Catholic Church or that it's New York City. Right, and I thought, well, I think they're part of the problem. Okay. I'm not saying that they're innocent, but I don't think they're not the sum total of what we're talking about. Right. There's much more. And it wouldn't make sense that, John's having a vision and he's somehow seeing New York City. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So I went back and I'm like, all of the answers pretty much are found in the area of Mesopotamia, which have different names, the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, Sumer, all this different stuff. But it all goes back to there. So when we're going to interpret these symbols, and there are many symbols in the book of Revelation, we have to go back and first understand what it means. And I use the analogy of a traffic light, right? So for everyone who's been raised in a place where they have cars, and if you've taken driver's ed, you should know that a red light means stop, green light means go, and yellow light, well, we're still deciding if that means go faster or slow down, right? But we know these symbols because we've grown up with these symbols. And, we're like, well, red light, of course, it means stop, obviously. But to somebody who did not grow up in a civilization with cars, they'd be like, what do you mean a red light means stop? I don't get it. But to us, it's very, very obvious. And so once we understand the definition of the symbol, then we can act upon that red light. It goes from being just this abstract symbol to now being very something concrete where I have to do something about this. And that's the same thing in the book of Revelation, is that yes, there are many symbols, and without the proper definition of what these mean, we're kind of like, I don't get it. But once we are able to define them, and we can often find those in the Bible itself, and other times, of course, we can go back to the ancient Near East and figure out what these things mean, then we're able to go in and plug these in and say, oh, that's what you're talking about, right? We're not talking about the Vatican or New York City. The woman that rides the beast is Inanna, and she was birthed, if you will, at the Tower of Babel, or the whole Babylonian system. And God is wrathful against that system, right? That is a system that has been around with us since the days of Babel, and it has proliferated. It has morphed and evolved throughout the entire world. There's not one place that I know of that does not have the influence of these symbols and these gods, and in one form or another, it has gotten around. And so God is going to deal with that system. And then also, I believe he's going to deal with the city itself in the days to come.
First time I had heard, of this type of imagery, even though it wasn't, how'd you say it? I guess the person introduced this concept to me was a guy named Michael Rood. I don't know if you ever know the name or not, but this is probably 10 years ago, et cetera.
Yeah.
So just one of the things that was like eye-opening to me, I mean, when you get into studying Israel and all of a sudden you see the paganism and the conflict between these two realms, the kingdom of darkness, kingdom of light, all of a sudden, you're faced with some very uncomfortable things because you are taught a certain way, you grew up a certain way, you understand the world in a certain worldview, and all of a sudden you recognize there really kind of is black and white in this world. There is a kingdom of light and a kingdom of darkness, and there really isn't a middle ground. The source point is actually kind of clear. There is a source point of good and there's a source point of evil. There's a source point of truth and deception, I guess. And so in our travels, subsequently, one of the like hugely eye-opening thing for me was like going to the city of Rome and seeing what counterfeit looks like. See, Rome, they try to proclaim themselves as being the eternal city. Well, they're not the eternal city. Jerusalem is the eternal city, and just little things like, they built the city of bricks, but put a facade of stone in. And if you go to Jerusalem, it's all stone originally. It's little nuances of facade versus reality. And sometimes when you're dealing with these things, we don't know the origins of what we deal with and how it has permeated Christendom as a whole. We just don't recognize it. Like, you look at the Pantheon, for instance, you go in there and wow, this is a really nice building. Oh, and by the way, look at all the saints in the niches. Why are the saints in the niches? The Pantheon was built to house all the deities of the Roman or Roman paganism back in the day. Now you've replaced that with saints. So all of a sudden you're merging these two systems, if you will, into that. Now, only reason I bring that up is because it was illuminating to us as I've studied this sort of thing, to recognize that there is a fight between two systems, and ultimately goes back to Sumer. If you really trace it all goes back there. And I think that for people that are really wanting to study and understand what's happening, it's vital that they understand that context and what God was doing from that very beginning.
Absolutely. And, that's one of the things I really bring out in the book, is that there was this battle going on. And, a huge buzzword is authority. So, sometimes people have asked, well, if God was going to send Jesus to die for our sins, why didn't he just do it immediately, right after Adam and Eve blew it? Well, because Satan's not an idiot, right? So the whole thing, you have to understand that God is omnipotent. He's all powerful, and Satan is not all powerful, right? He's powerful. He's definitely more powerful than we are, but he's no match for God, right? If they were to sit down and have an arm wrestling match, God would win, no question about it. So Satan, again, he's not an idiot. He doesn't think that he can come to a wrestling match with God and somehow win. What he did is, God basically creates the world, puts Satan in charge as the steward of the world. But he gives the world to Adam and Eve, right? They're the heirs of the world. And Satan didn't like this arrangement too well. He wanted to be, the top dog. He wanted it to be his. And so when God gave the dominion to Adam and Eve, basically you could think of it like Satan going over and say, hey, little boy, can I hold that key for you? Can I hold the dominion for you? And Adam's like, sure, okay. Right? And once Satan had it, he's not going to give it back. Now, he knows that God is righteous. God will never tell a lie. That is the one thing God cannot do. He cannot lie. Yeah. He will not lie. He will not violate his own righteousness. That's against his very character to do such a thing. And trust me, Satan is standing on the word of God, right? He is believing that God will do what he said, that God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Satan is standing on that promise because that's what gives him his power, is that he has authority. So God makes the world, gives it to Adam, then Adam foolishly gives it to Satan. All right, so now Satan's like, hey, I've got the keys. In fact, what we find in the ancient Near East is that Enlil held the tablet of destinies that gave him authority over the affairs of man. It gave him the ability to decree fates. This is a big thing, and he makes a big thing about it. In fact, I talk about in the book this thing called the Akitu Festival. I'll tell you, when I discovered this, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. This is crazy, right? But in the Akitu Festival, the earthly king would dress up and pretend to be either Enlil, or often it would be his son, Ninurta, whose name means Lord of the Earth. And so he would pretend to be Ninurta, and then he would bring the good news. That's the word that they use, the Busurat Salmi, which is the good news of peace. I'm like, again, this is crazy, because it's the same phrase that we see in Hebrew, the Busurat Shalom. So here you have the same phrase that's being used. And the good news is that Ninurta had killed Anu, who is the creator god, and he's bringing this good news to Enlil. And you're like, wait, why would this be good news? Well, because they don't like the creator god. That's the whole point. They don't like him. And so Enlil then says, look, I have the Anu-ship. I have the power and the authority of Anu. The creator god, he's dead. And now I have his authority and his power. Those are now vested in me. And then I will give those to whoever I want. And then that's called the Enlil-ship. And so then Enlil then gives this to Ninurta, and Ninurta is said to be his son. All right. And that's a whole nother story about Nimrod. But we see in this festival that Enlil is basically bragging. He's like, look, I got God over a barrel. Look, I'm not the creator God. I never said I was, but I pulled a fast one on the creator God. And now I have the tablet of destinies. I have the thing that gives me authority over the earth. And what's amazing is that when Jesus came, he did not challenge that statement. Yeah. Satan took him up onto a high mountain and said, look, all this stuff has been delivered to me. All these kingdoms, they're mine, and I can give them to whoever I want. If you'll just bow down, I'll give them to you. Glad Jesus didn't do that. That was really good. But Jesus wasn't like, whatever, Satan, come on. We both know that you don't have such a thing. Jesus did not challenge it at all. And because it's true. In fact, we see many places where he talks about the God of this age, the God of this world, right? He's got nothing on me. He's going to be judged, and all this different language that Jesus uses to speak about. But the only way that Satan could be judged, because he had the keys of death and Sheol, death and Hades, the only way was to overcome him and beat him at his own game. So if Satan is the god of the dead or god of death, then you have to beat death in order to overcome Satan. Yeah. And that's exactly what Jesus did. I mean, this whole thing is a cosmic duel between God and Satan. Again, it's not that Satan has equal power, but he usurped God. And that was one of his favorite titles. He's the usurper, and that he stole the authority. But once he had that authority, God couldn't just, lightning bolt him and then give me that authority back. It doesn't work that way. That would be unjust, and God is not unjust. He's righteous. And so in order to get back that which had been forfeited by Adam, he then has to become a son of Adam, and he has to die. Again, not all of this was absolutely clear from the beginning, right? All Satan knew is that there was this prophecy of doom, that I will cause enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. You will strike his heel and he will crush your head. So this was hanging over Satan for thousands of years. He doesn't know when this seed of the woman, this promised one, is going to show up, right? So he's like, man, I better get ready. I better make sure that I've got my game ready to go. And I think this is why we see the incursion of the Nephilim, right? Satan is trying to get ready. He's trying to prepare and to make sure that his reign of terror will continue indefinitely, right? Again, he knows that God is smart, right? He knows that. He's not messing with some weakling. And that if God has said that he's going to reclaim the earth, then he has real intentions to reclaim the earth. So Satan has to then somehow cement his rule in the earth, right? He does this whole thing with the Nephilim that goes down the drain. And so then after the flood, he starts again with just one person, and that is with Nimrod. And through Nimrod and the Tower of Babel and all this is where we get this false religious system. And why do we need a false religious system? Well, it's just like going fishing, right? If you just put a hook in the water, yeah, the fish probably won't bite, right? They're not absolutely stupid. But if you lure them, if you lure the fish with something shiny or a worm, then they're likely to bite onto that hook. And once they've bitten, you don't need the lure anymore, right? Because now you've got them. And so the lure is the woman that rides the beast. What is this woman? Well, she represents lust. It could be sexual lust. It could be lust for money, lust for fame, lust for power. You name it. It doesn't really matter, right? But whatever you're lusting for, Satan's like, I've got just what you're asking for, right? And the woman represents that. But what is she riding? She's riding the beast. So who's really in control? Is it the rider or the one who she's riding? Well, you'd think it's the rider. But we see in Revelation 17 that the beast is going to hate her and is going to burn her with fire. Because once the beast or the Antichrist finally has the world hooked and we can't get away. Absolutely. And that's in volume 3. I'm working on that. But that will be where it's like, okay, I've got you. You're hooked. You can't get away. We don't need this woman anymore. We don't need the lure because now you're mine. Now you guys have taken the mark of the beast. You can't get away, right? You're mine forever. And so then he'll eventually get rid of the woman. But for now, he needs to convince us or, to lure us into following this false system so that we become his slaves. And unfortunately, he's doing a pretty good job, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tremendous amount of material and a tremendous truth that is definitely present even to this day. I mean, we look at like the powers. I mean, just right now, with COVID and coronavirus and all that sort of thing, how you can take a small situation and leverage it for, I guess you could say, good and evil. It's given the opportunity, Satan will use whatever he can to do as much evil as possible. So let's get a little bit. So Mount Hermon, this Mount Hermon connection, and Nimrod or Ninurta. You kind of, I guess there's a lot of different names there. So there's Nimrod, Ninurta, Hercules, Heracles. All basically you're tying to being the same person, and then the Mount Hermon event, which is Genesis 6 and First Enoch as well. In your mind, and you talked about this inscription, and this is kind of a unique discovery that you had written about in your book as far as connecting the what's it called, the stone. I can't think of the name of it. The stone that was found. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just the Mount Hermon inscription. I don't know that it has a name that's necessarily. But so this inscription, probably from around, somewhere, it's a Greek inscription, let's put it that way. And it was found in 1869, I think it was, by Charles Warren. Okay. And so then it was taken to the British Museum, and he translated it, the British Museum translated it, and then later on, George Nicholsburg from Harvard University translated it. And, I had kind of been hearing about this inscription, and I was like, I really want to see it for myself because, where is the Greek? What does it actually say? So I finally was able to trace it back to George Nicholsburg, and he said that his translation was, according to the command of the great and holy God, those taking an oath proceed from here, or these proceeding from here take an oath. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but why would it say holy God, right? It doesn't make sense because the holy God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he certainly did not tell them to come down. Who are they? Well, if you look at First Enoch, there is a record there of these, roughly 200 angels led by Samyaza, who came down and they took an oath which is what the mountain means. Hermon is a cherem. It means to imprecate yourself or to take an oath, saying, I'm going to do this or else, right? And that's how the mountain was named, is this whole idea of an oath. And so we see this going back a very long way. And so this inscription was very interesting. And I went back, I looked at the Greek, and I was struck by the words "and holy," kai hagios, are not in the text. And I thought, this is weird, because I know that George Nicholsburg is an excellent scholar. So I would never, call into question his scholarship. And yet I kept looking at this thing and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, because it just doesn't say that. And so I discovered two words. The first one is bo, which I trace back to be a prefix meaning bull or ox. And that is very much in line with what we see as far as the descriptions of who Satan is from the cherubim, right? One of the faces of an ox. Then we see numerous depictions of Satan as a bull. He's also called the bull. We see it in many writings that he's known as the bull of heaven, etc. So I was like, and I felt comfortable with that. And then the other word was this word batios. And I was like, I just looked everywhere. I looked and looked and looked in every lexicon I could think of, every website I could think of, every scholarly journal I could think of. Nobody had anything on this word batios. I think this is really crazy. But then I found it. I did find it, and it was in a grotto, in a cave in southern Italy. And I was just like, wait, this word, I've only found it two places in the entire world. And why would it be on top of Mount Hermon and then also in a cave in Italy? Well, long story short, I discovered that it's related. It was an epithet for Zeus. And what was interesting is that the scholars in Italy, they thought it must be some kind of a local epithet, right? So, but you can only have a local epithet if you have a place, right? So, if you have the Dallas Cowboys, you first have to have Dallas, right? You can't just have the Cowboys. You've got to have the Dallas Cowboys. And that's how it works, right? So we cannot have Zeus Batios if there's no city known as Batios. And there wasn't. I looked at the maps and all the literature, and there was nothing there. So what I finally discovered is that this word, the word bat or bad, B-A-D, is actually a hidden symbol for the name Enlil. So when you start looking at cuneiform, a lot of the symbols have their own name. Just like in English, we have the letter W. But that's a name. Nobody says W or H, right? We don't say, H-L-O, right? We say hello, right? But the name of the letter is H, and the same thing with W. So what we're talking about here is this ancient symbol that has a name, and you don't pronounce the name, but this name then became a syncretism. It became a common symbol that the scribes were using to describe Enlil, to describe Dagon, and the other shared features that you have, the other aliases of Satan in the ancient world. So I got kind of excited about that. And for me, what this does is it really proves that here you have a Sumerian loanword in a Greek document talking about Satan, right? So this isn't just some whatever kind of thing, but it proves that this has to be talking about Satan, because this word exists in no other place, right? The only explanation is that it was taken from Sumerian, it was then Hellenized, and it was put into this inscription, and the scribes understood who they were talking about, but nobody else would have understood who they were talking about. And so Satan was the one that gave the command to the angels to come down on Mount Hermon and to then begin this whole process of making these Nephilim. Yeah.
And that, and the Nephilim part, basically in the book, you kind of cover that it was kind of a plan to create, just as me, paraphrasing here, but basically create bodies or something that they could then inhabit and express themselves in the visible world, is because they are locked away, if you will, in the invisible or unseen.
Yeah, it's like the movie Avatar, Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then post flood, you would kind of hold that a similar thing happened with Nimrod, or would you consider that more a demonic, maybe possession kind of a thing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's tricky because we're taking the breadcrumbs that we have, and we're trying to make a case and understand what was happening. But my whole suggestion is that I am not persuaded that evil, malevolent beings could come down, create this race of hybrids, and that these hybrids would then have their own spirit, and they would then be automatically doomed to go to hell or destruction, right? So what I understand God is that he creates us in his own image, and he creates us with the ability to choose. We get to choose our destiny. Satan had the privilege of choosing his destiny. Right. So to think that an entire race of beings, sentient beings, would be able to be brought in, procreated, and then through no fault of their own other than being born, they're going to be consigned to hell. It just doesn't make sense in my mind. So what I'm suggesting is that Satan, who it talks about, he's not clothed, and that demons want to be clothed. They want to have a covering. So he lost his covering, so I don't know that he's disembodied necessarily, but he lost his covering. He lost something, and it's painful. And so somehow there's some comfort that Jesus talks about that demons find in being inside of a body. And so they're looking for a body. And so this whole idea that I understand, and this is a point that Tom Horn touches on and other researchers, but that basically these Nephilim were biosuits, right? These were, meat suits, skin suits, whatever you want to call them, that did not have a conscience, did not have a soul of their own. Kind of like in the movie Avatar, where they're able to create this alien body, and then it's inhabited by the human person, right? And so that's the basic idea, is that he wanted to create something that he and other fallen angels could then not just possess, but they could inhabit, and they could live in, and they could rightfully claim, this is my body. So that's the basic idea there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, there's a lot of, I shouldn't say stigma, but there's a lot of people that question the whole Genesis 6 and thing. And they, how could that be actual offspring and this, and maybe that's the lineage of, what's that? Seth or whatever.
Seth. Yeah.
And it just, when you study, especially Second Temple literature, the clarity you get of how they saw the world and how they understood the world back then, it gives so much clarity to the issue of Genesis 6 of definitely being fallen angels and what happened there, perpetuating evil to the point where God had to literally destroy the world to save humanity. Now, I don't forget it. It sparked my memory, but there was a documentary I watched some years ago. I want to say it was History Channel, where they were looking at old. What am I talking about? Body, or I should say skeletons, probably, from people trying to see if there was DNA in the or a different set of DNA in the ancient world. And I believe, if I remember right, that they found a different sequence of DNA that they said is human-ish, but it wasn't like our modern human DNA. I don't know.
Is that like Neanderthals or something?
Well, it wasn't Neanderthal, but it was like ancient, whatever.
Okay.
And it
sure.
Again, I should look it up because it's literally probably been 10 years ago when I saw that material. But it sparks to memory that, I think in the world that we live in today, we're so primed to start to see these things come to fruition. For instance, we have the CRISPR-9 technology, the gene editing, and genetically modifying stuff. We just literally week and a half ago, the whole monkey human embryo thing that they were pulling off. I mean, literally, we're living in a time when that technology that seems to have existed in Genesis is kind of coming back. And now they're talking about raising organs with human animal mixtures, cell stuff, and fusing that with human. I mean, we're there. Like we're in the middle of this.
I know.
And we don't even it just seems like, oh, this is just science. This is well, who's inspiring this stuff? Like who is wanting this stuff to come to fruition? And then you mentioned, I don't know if it was you or not, strike my memory, but basically the Enlil was buried supposedly under the Euphrates.
Gilgamesh. Yeah.
Gilgamesh. I'm sorry. Gilgamesh. Yeah. What if some of this stuff would start to come out, and you would take DNA and you would try to revive that sort of thing? Like, it's not beyond the scope of feasibility in our world, in the next 100 years, perhaps, that some of this stuff could happen. I mean, they're talking about doing it to dinosaurs, to woolly mammoths.
Oh, yeah.
They're trying to do this.
I don't think we need 100 years. I don't think we need 100 years. I mean, it's happening at breakneck speed. Right. There was an article that came out in 2019 about a man named Chris out of Reno, Nevada. He had leukemia, and so he got a bone marrow transplant from a donor in Germany. And so he had some friends that were working at a laboratory, like the crime scene investigation laboratories, right? And I'm blanking on the word there, but what they did is they took samples of his DNA before he got the bone marrow transplant, and then after. And so shortly after, they discovered that his blood cells were those of his donor. And then about 3 or 4 months later, they discovered that pretty much all of his DNA had the signature of his donor. And especially what's amazing is that his sperm was not his. It was that of his donor. And
that's crazy.
I'm like, okay, that's crazy, right? So, so if he were to sire children, they would not technically be his. Right? The signature, the DNA signature would be that of the guy in Germany, not this guy, Chris. Wow. So what that says to me is we're playing with things we don't understand. Now, let me make it very clear. I'm not anti-science. I'm very pro-science. Sure. I mean, we have all kinds of horror movies about this, right? I Am Legend, right? The whole idea is that, they were trying to help humanity, but then they botched it. And then everybody turned into a zombie, and
yeah, I mean, there's so much. Well, like you said, in films and movies and even the scientific community, basically saying, well, it's pretty much a guarantee that extraterrestrial life exists, and people getting comfortable with that, people being taught that in schools, that it's pretty much a guarantee at some point in here before too long that we're going to encounter extraterrestrials. The conditioning is so obvious to me. And when I was, when we were studying this last winter during studying prophecy, we basically, I mean, nobody knows for sure. There's a lot of speculation involved, but it just seems so clear to us as well that what you're dealing with in the last days, and I know your first book's written about that, and I haven't read it. I apologize. I'll do that in the future.
It's okay.
But, what you're dealing with is some kind of incarnation of Satan, because he gives him all the authority and all the power, regardless of who he identifies with initially. So initially he could come from, who knows, if you take Daniel, 11 or whatever, you could say King of the North, that kind of imagery or whatever, or Daniel 8, you could say the East, West, that whole stuff. But regardless of that, he's the ultimate, I guess, offspring, you would say, of Satan himself. And I personally believe, and this is just my opinion, that really what he's fighting over, his ultimate objective, is one final play for the Davidic throne. It's why he centers around Jerusalem. It's why he's interested in Jerusalem, why he's interested in the temple, is because it's the last place that he might be able to, like, literally, if you believe in the coming messianic era, okay, the 1,000 years, where he rolls the dice and goes for it. Time's short. He's thrown to earth. All right, rolls the dice. I'm going for it. He's going for the throne. He wants to be known not only in his own title, but he wants to be known as the God of Israel. Along those lines. Now, I understand there's some complexities there, but I see that, at least in part, that's the goal. And then I picked up on the imagery that you had as far as the Nimrod connection. I mean, Nimrod, so a lot of people look to like Antiochus or Antiochus Epiphanes as being a type and shadow of the Antichrist. Frankly, I think Nimrod is a far better candidate. When you brought that out, it was just like, that makes a lot of sense to me. That he could totally be the type for that. So, all right, now we're back. I think we're good. So basically, Paul in Thessalonians talks about the lawless one. And it's kind of an interesting term. Not that I'm an expert or a scholar, but it caught my attention. And a few weeks ago, I was going through the book of, First Enoch, and it talks about lawless ones. Of course, it's a translation, not original, but this concept seems to have come from that. And, we often think of Antiochus maybe as being a type of Antichrist, but you mentioned, Nimrod, a resurrected Nimrod, the one who was, is not, and will be, I think, if
will ascend out of the abyss.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. That to me makes a lot more sense, because you have this connection to the activity of Satan, like Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians, activity of Satan. So when you know the activity in the ancient world, all of a sudden it's connected to the activity of Satan and lawless ones. In the mind of a first century Jew, you're dealing with probably Nephilim, that sort of material in their minds, more than you're dealing with an Antiochus. As bad as he was, in their minds, they're thinking more further back.
Well, it's certainly hard to say what they were thinking in regards to that. But what we do know is that that Nimrod became a Gibor, right? So that is huge. And there's so much packed into that little statement. First of all, the first thing to understand is that Nimrod is not his given name. Nimrod means let's rebel. What parent's going to name their kid let's rebel? It doesn't make any sense, I mean, even evil parents want their kids to clean their room, So you can rebel against those people, not against me. All right. So what we find is that when we go back to Akkadian, we find that Nin Urta literally means Lord of the earth, right? So it's like, wow, So then what happened is the Bible took that. They took that title, Nin Urta, Lord of the earth, and said, no, you're not the Lord of the earth. You just think you are. But we're going to call you what you really are. But what's so amazing is that it maintained the same root letters. So when you think about Semitic languages, it's always about root letters. So it took the same root letters, Nin Urta, and it just took the N, the R, and the T, and then you can swap those out for a N, R, and a D, or a Nimrod. You can put it in, so the N and the M are the same, and then R and D, R and T, they're the same. So then it becomes Nimrod, or Nimrod in the Bible. So now he's known as the rebel, but that's not his name. That's merely a title of what he's like, what he did, what his actions were like. He was the rebel. And this rebel he did not start this way, but he became a Gibor. And when you look at that in the Septuagint, they translate it as Gigas. Gigas means giant. Yep, sure. And it was very well understood what that word meant. This was a son of earth and heaven. This was a hybrid. This was a demigod. And so he becomes this demigod. How does he become a demigod? Well, scripture doesn't tell us. It just says that he did. It just says that he became a Gibor. And so I went and I looked at what Satan did with Judas Iscariot, is that it says that he entered him, right? So he's possessing Judas, and now Judas still has his right mind. He's got the faculties of his mind, but now Satan is controlling him. He's doing Satan's bidding. Why would he do this? And he's also known as a son of perdition. That's kind of interesting. So what I would suggest, and this is also based on what we were talking about before, where this guy, Chris from Reno, Nevada, that his DNA was transformed to that of his donor. I would suggest that what Satan did is that he overshadowed Nimrod. In other words, he possessed Nimrod. And if he were to possess him for a long enough time, and this is where I'm hypothesizing, but if he were to continue this relationship, that it's possible that Satan would be able to impart his DNA into Nimrod so that he somehow became a Gibor, right? Because he's known in the ancient world, this Ninurta, he is known as the son of Enlil, right? He is the definitive son of Enlil. He's the one who is carrying the tablet of destinies given to him by his father Enlil. And it's amazing because what we see in Revelation 13 is that, is that the beast is going to have all of the power, the throne, and the authority of Satan. I'm convinced that Satan doesn't like to share, that he's quite selfish. I think that's kind of what he's known for, is being a bit selfish. Sure. And so, for him to give his power, his throne, and his authority to somebody, I don't think so. That doesn't happen every day. This is something very special. This is a very unique relationship where Satan still is the one pulling the strings, not the human that he's giving it to. And so what I would suggest is that Satan needed Nimrod, and Nimrod basically believed the sales pitch. Hey, you'll become a god. You'll have all these powers. You'll live for a super long time. Right. You'll be known as the hero forever and ever. And someday, I'll try to resurrect you or something like that. So I don't think, Satan was too concerned about keeping his promises, but he was a necessary, link in the chain for Satan to then have more direct control over the earth. Because when you were talking to Ninurta, you were talking to Enlil. There was really no difference, even though there was a difference, but there was no qualitative difference. You were, if you're talking to Ninurta, you're talking to Enlil. And that's just how it was. But what's also amazing is that Enlil then became known as, he was also known as Martu, who was the god of the Amorites. And remember, we were talking about his logogram, that his logogram was Bad, and that's what we found on that inscription. Well, guess what was the logogram for Martu, god of the Amorites? Bad, right? It's that same symbol. So the scribes understood that we're dealing with the same entity. The same entity is the one who is behind these different gods. Oh, and what does the symbol mean? Well, it means death, right? That's kind of a big deal. It's related to the word Og, right? Og and Ug are the same. I'm going to talk about something in volume 3, which should blows my mind, but there's another relationship. But anyway, they're all related. So Martu, the god of the Amorites, is essentially Nimrod or Enlil, and they have the same logogram to prove it. Now, what's amazing is that around the same time where, Ninurta does his stuff and all this, well, guess who God calls out of that area? Abraham, right? Get out of this place to a land that I'm going to show you, right? And so then he goes and so then God says, look, know for certain that your descendants are going to be slaves. And in the 4th generation, I'll bring them back. Why? Because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. I would argue that the iniquity of the Amorites was that they were becoming gods. They were becoming Giborim. They were becoming mighty ones. They were becoming these hybrids. And so Satan starts with Nin Urta, and then somehow he's able, either through a procreative process or through somehow an overshadowing process, he's able to pass on this hybrid DNA to these other people, so that by the time the children of Israel come out of Egypt, they come back to the promised land, and Satan has a housewarming gift for them. Hey, surprise, here's all these Amorites, or, because the Amorites became known as Nephilim. They became known as the, as the giants.
Was it Anakim or not necessarily?
The Anakim, exactly. Yeah. Right. The Anakim, the Rephaim, these are all known as hybrids. Yeah. And this is the housewarming gift that Satan left for them. Right? Because look, Satan doesn't know the future. I think he's probably playing 4-dimensional chess, and he can make pretty good analyses of what's going on, but he does not know the future. He can only prognosticate what the future is going to be. Just like we don't really know the weather tomorrow, but we can make amazing models about the weather tomorrow. Right? And we only know the weather tomorrow. Then we know the weather, but today we can really prognosticate. So Satan can forecast what's going to happen. And so he's been forecasting, as to what's happening. And he's like, my nemesis, my arch enemy, God, has now called this guy Abraham, and he's going to take him to this place called Canaan. I know where that is. Right. No problem. I'll just overrun the place so that, he cannot set up a beachhead there, and we will do our thing. And that's what they did. And then God dealt with them, so much so that the Amorites, God says in the book of Amos, he said, "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorites, whose height was like the cedars and whose strength was like the oaks." Yeah. Well, a cedar tree is really tall, right? Even a short cedar tree, so they can get up to 80 feet. But God also likens the cedar tree to the tail of the behemoth, and I suggest that's probably the sauropod dinosaur, but the Diplodocus dinosaur, I should say, which had a tail of 46 feet long, right? So we're somewhere in the ballpark of 40 feet long, right? These are huge, and God's like, I took care of the Amorites who were this tall. So this tells us that some pretty crazy stuff was going on. Also, you had the two king of the Amorites. One of them was Og, king of the Bashan. And so I talk about the term Bashan, which comes from Akkadian, which is Bashmu in Akkadian, and it means, drumroll, snake dragon, right? You're like, wow, this is crazy. So, and that was one of the signs, or that was one of the icons for Satan, for Enlil. And it's amazing how it all goes back to him. And we just happen to have found, I have to thank Derek Gilbert for this, but we found a geoglyph in the land of Israel right next to the Gilgal Rephaim, which is the circle of the giants. Yeah. So when you look at it from Google Earth, you can see this snake, this big geoglyph snake on the earth, and it's in that same vicinity as Bashan. It's in the land of Bashan. So Bashan means snake dragon, right? And this is, of course, where Og was hanging out. Mount Hermon. This takes us back to Mount Hermon, where that was kind of like the headquarters for Og and these other kings of death of the Rephaim and all this other stuff. So, I mean, it blew my mind when I was just like, what? That's all connected? Crazy.
The first time, this is, of course, 10 years ago or 11 years ago when my dad's first trip to Israel, went up to the Golan Heights. And this time we didn't really know a lot of this stuff. We just weren't around the material. And, but he made this comment when he was going through the Golan Heights. He said, there's something about this place that it must be that all wars that have ever existed have come out of this place. Like he just sensed it was kind of odd that he said it, but he just like, there's something about this place that all wars came out of this place somehow, that something is up here or whatever. He just said I mean, it just sensed that. I mean, it just has this feel of death that, that he sensed. And I remember him speaking that. That was long before, I really understood what was going on. Herman and even Bashan, meaning, serpent and all that good stuff, just didn't make the connections. I mean, so he wasn't speaking in, knowing this, saying it. He didn't know. He just was driving through and it's just like, well, there's something going on up here. And he sensed that. And if you realize Caesarea Philippi, even to this day, for me, if I go there, I almost don't even want to go up there. It just,
oh, wow. Yeah.
There's just a darkness there. Of course you go to the top of, I've been on top of Herman as well, but like when I go to Caesarea, sometimes I'll just send people, you go up there and look. I just don't know. I don't even know if I want to go up there. It's just so much evil. So such a dark history. And really, the spirit that we see even working in today with abortion, et cetera, like it's just the same, just bloodthirsty spirit that wants to kill off the offspring for the sake of what do you want to call it, fertility or choice or whatever it is. And it's just such a, I don't know. I just still feel that when I go to these places, but yeah.
Well, it's ultimately the kingdom of self. It's ultimately the kingdom of self, right? That's what Satan's kingdom is all about. It's about me. And God's kingdom is about give. It's about others. It's about being a servant. It's a huge contrast. And I kind of wove that through the entire book, that we see this contrast between these two kingdoms. Satan was given everything. He was kind of like Joseph to Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh's like, look, I'm still Pharaoh, this is my throne, but beyond that, you're the boss, and that's essentially what God did, is that he's like, look, I'm God, that's my throne, but I'm putting you in charge of it all, Satan. And Satan wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted to be the heir as well. He wanted everything for himself. And when he did that, he in a sense lost everything, but he then gained it by usurping God's authority, by questioning God's authority, and then gaining the authority for himself. But here's what's amazing. And we kind of started this talk off, talking about the Parthenon and everything, where you have these ancient gods, these ancient pagan gods, they really did die at the cross. And the reason I believe they died is because Jesus took back the authority that Satan had for some 4,000 years. He bought that back. And so even though, Satan and the gang didn't go away, but they lost the authority that gave them rights over mankind. They lost that. Now, he still has another game plan. Don't make no mistake about that. Yep. But it's a different game plan now. He's had to alter it. And we kind of touched on what the Antichrist or the beast is going to do. And I'm talking a lot about this in volume 3, where, the whole thing about the apostasy must happen before the son of perdition can come back. There's that term again, right? Yep. Well, that has to do with authority. And so I get into that in the book. But what you'll see is that the beast has authority. He has authority. And that's the only way he can then, stand up to God and blaspheme God and those who dwell in heaven, is because he has authority once again. And with that authority, now God has told us it's not going to last very long, right, but we have the inside scoop, right? But he has to get authority in order to be able to battle God. Without authority, you can't battle God. There's no chance at all. And so this was the big game changer. I mean, we all know it, that Jesus died for our sins, and hallelujah, right? But it's so much bigger than that. It's so much more at this cosmic, huge level. You're like, oh, yes, Jesus had to die. There's no way that he could have redeemed us aside from dying and then rising again. Some people, well, why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Yep. Well, was it just for my little sins? Well, that's part of the story. It's part of the story. But there's a much bigger story to understand. So my responsibility as an individual is to confess my sins, repent of them, and acknowledge that what he did on the cross was sufficient to save me. So hallelujah for that. But it has it's just so much bigger. The implications are cosmic when we look at this. And this is this huge battle between God and Satan. And it's not over. Satan's not going down without a fight. He is going to fight tooth and nail to the bitter end. And I'll be talking about that in Corrupting Image Volume 3.
That's awesome. Well, we're almost out of time here. I don't want to hold you longer than need be here, but give us a little bit of just some references. I know you have a website, books, and all that sort of stuff. So just give us some information about your ministry, etc. Before we wrap this up.
Yeah, so you can go to douglashamp.com. You can learn more about me. I think all of my books are there. I put pretty much everything as articles on my website. So if you want to just poke around, you can see it all there. If people are interested, they can get the book. It's on my website as an ebook. It's also available at Amazon if they want to get the paperback or the Kindle version. So Corrupting the Image Volume 2. If they want to get Volume 1, I would encourage that, of course. I think that really sets the foundation. Sure. And then I'm the pastor of the Way Congregation in Lakewood, Colorado. And so if people would like to join us, we'd love to have them. Every Saturday we meet at 10:30 a.m. for worship, and then we start the teaching around 11:15. And so it's messianic flavor, and I teach through the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. I love the whole thing. I love Yeshua. I love Jesus. And so that's pretty much it. So then go to thewaycongregation.com for more information about that, or then go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Doug Hamp, and they can find my videos there.
That's awesome. And I would encourage you guys, I've been having a lot of fun listening to the roundtable, prophecy roundtable that you've been putting out there. And John, is it John Haller?
John Haller.
So he's a fellow Ohioan. So, he literally is about probably an hour and a half from where I live. So someday I might have to try to meet up with him sometime. It'd be a fun conversation. So anyway, go Buckeyes. Anyway.
Very cool.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know, like I said, you're busy. My dad being a pastor, I understand how challenging it can be to take time and do some of these things. So I just thank you and bless you for doing that. So
thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this show. I certainly did. And something that I think all of us can take away from all of this is when we study prophecy, look, there's always elements that we don't understand. We don't see the full picture. God, he sees the full picture, and in his time, he will reveal to us what his plans are fully. But until then, prophecy does shine as a light in a dark place, so that we are not left in darkness, not knowing what is happening. And so when we have bits and pieces like this, prophecy is this beautiful mosaic that God puts together, and bits and pieces that we get, I think make such a huge difference to us seeing ultimately the victory that Jesus will have when he returns and comes back. And I think for us, it gives us hope that God has not forgotten us, not forsaken us, but that he has a process, and there's a process to this. And in due time, he will certainly overcome the evil one, and we will be resurrected and live the lives that God really wanted us to live from the beginning. So that's it for this program. I would invite you to join us for more programs. And if you have any comments or whatever, I'd be happy to reply to those. Again, keep them cordial, keep them civil. And if you want to write to me, you can also contact me through the website. So blessings to you, and have a good one.